All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started a little bit late, but that seems to be what happens with second panels, I think. So my name is Kimberlie Orr, and I am the International Legal Fellow here at the Religious Liberty Clinic. It is my job to direct the international portion of the work that we do at the clinic. And I just want to introduce this wonderful, wonderful panel and get into it, but I want to orient what is so important to us about this specific topic. Our clinic, in partnership with our colleague, esteemed and friend, Nuri Turkel, who has just recently finished his tenure as a U.S. USERF commissioner, and in partnership with Bellwether International, with Rachel Miner, we did a delegation to France, where we investigated the issues of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We were able to meet with civil society, religious leaders, and government to really try to drill down and raise some concerns about the issues that are arising there in France. We believe that what happens in France extends to the world. They're really important geopolitically, as far as Europe is concerned, and generally across the world. And so it was a really important issue to discuss, and we have a forthcoming report on our findings. And so we are so blessed for the diverse panelists that we have here who will actually be able to give a really robust representation of the issues that we are facing there. We will begin with Rachel Miner, who is the founder and CEO of Bellwether International, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to building genocide resistance through freedom of religion or belief and economic development. And I'm just giving very brief bios so that we can, every one of my panelists is welcome to give more information about their work. Rachel is going to discuss the geopolitical importance of France in setting trends, particularly within Europe and across the world. Then, unfortunately, we have another panelist who is currently flying in, I think, right now into Chicago. So we have a recorded video by her, but her name is Dr. Marie Daoud. She is a historian and lecturer in French language and literature at the Oriel College of Oxford. Her research focuses on the connections between literature, politics, and religion between the French Revolution and the Second World War. She's going to give us a very important background on the issue of laïcité. You cannot understand what is happening in France without understanding that context from which most of these laws that have come to the fore are founded and based in. And then we'll have the pleasure of hearing from Luke Wilson. He is a legal researcher at the United States Commission of International Religious Freedom. There he monitors and reports on religious freedom conditions in Europe and Latin America, as well as developments in international human rights law. He's going to discuss in more detail about the current laws and regulations there, including the hijab bans and their inconsistency with international human rights law and the rise of anti-Semitism. We'll also hear from Justice Ann Powers, who is a judge on the Court of Appeals in Ireland since 2019. She has previously served as a presiding judge of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers and Specialist Prosecutor's Office from 2017 to 2019, and a judge of the European Court of Human Rights from 2008 to 2020. And so she specifically had to grapple with this as these laws that were implemented in France as they were raised to the European Court of Human Rights. And finally, we have Dr. Haifa Tlili. She is a French sociologist whose doctoral work focused on cross-cultural comparison of the relationship between the body and sport among females sports and their relation with the Arab Muslim cultures in France and Tunisia. Since 2013, she has worked with various associations and NGOs to create programs and to promote women and empowerment and leadership in sport. Her work includes the Hijabous, whose work focused on changing the French Football Federation rules. And in 2023, she co-founded Basket for All, succeeding for the first time in getting basketball stakeholders, recognized rights defenders such as OHCR, OHCHR, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others involved in sports. And I just wanted to comment, as we'll hear from her, we met with some government officials from the National Commission on Human Rights in France, and they said that this may be the one area of work and space that we will be able to work on the rights of women in hijab. So the work that Dr. Haifa Tlili has done is of crucial importance. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Rachel. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks so much. It's hard to ignore France right now. I don't know if you're following the politics. If you're not, maybe you're following sports. France just had a snap election. The far right was leading in the polls. On Sunday, Macron created a coalition between the centrists and the far left. They barely came out on top. It's kind of an unprecedented time for the French Parliament. There's no majority, so it's literally hanging in the balance. The Olympics start July 26th, but as Kimberlie mentioned, France is a bellwether in Europe, particularly on this topic. I don't know if we can cue my slides. If not, then I'll just keep going. France has two particularly important characteristics I want to highlight. First, the largest Jewish population in all of Europe is in France. And second, the largest Muslim population in all of Europe is in France. So we have two really important religious groups, both of Abrahamic descent, both largely represented in France. But maybe representation is the wrong word, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. So looking specifically at the French context. That might be the wrong slide. Yeah, do we have the other slides by chance? There are just, the numbers are contested because the French government does not record their census on the basis of religion. We actually don't know the exact number of Jews or Muslims in France. It's estimated that there's between 400,000 to 800,000 Jews, 400 to 800,000, and which is just about 0.3, 0.4% of the population in France. So a very, very, very small percent of France is Jewish. The Muslim population is between 3 to 5 million, which is 10% of the French population. So I'm trying to paint a picture here. We have a very small but significant population of Jewish people and a very large but relatively small compared to globally. There are just over 15 million Jews, and globally there are 2 billion Muslims. So that's the demographic picture. The next component. When we look at hatred in the context of France against Jews or against Muslims, we have to look at the context of immigration. Jews are not immigrating broadly across the world, but they're certainly not immigrating to France. The Jews that are in France have been there since the Holocaust or before. They have deep roots, generational transmission of faith and sentiment. So Jews are not really part of the immigration context. Muslims are nearly the antithesis of that. Muslims are 43.8% immigrants, and 31% are descendants of immigrants. So the entire Muslim population has immigrated to France in various waves, but the majority in the last 50 to 100 years. So most of the hatred against the Muslim population is connected to their immigration status, which I know Kimberlie is the actual expert on immigration, so I won't get too much into that. Hopefully she can add some thoughts there. The choice of religion as a dimension of identity also varies between the Jewish population and the Muslim population. Muslims, 30%, so 1/3 of Muslims, identify with religion as the main component of their identity. So we might think about this in the Catholic comparison, right? There are Catholics who go to Mass on Easter and Christmas, and there are Catholics who go to Mass every week. The Muslims who are going to mosque every week are just 30% of who's in France. Jews, in the contrast, nearly 60% of Jews attend synagogue weekly. So you have a very active Jewish, but small Jewish population. You have a huge Muslim population that's less active in their faith identity. The next thing that I wanted to talk about, no slides, okay, no problem, is the perception of the other in France. Jews and Muslims are attacked differently. They're attacked through different channels. Jews bear the burden of attacks in the private sphere. Anti-Semitic attacks are primarily happening in schools, and in homes. Jewish attacks tend to be lethal and deadly. People end up wounded or deceased. On the opposite side, Muslims bear the burden of discrimination. The hatred against Muslims is passing through public sphere and not the private sphere. So whereas Jews are being targeted in private spaces, Muslims are being targeted in public spaces through political speech, through employment discrimination. There was a national sentiment analysis done in France, the perception of Islam and Islamic practices. 93% of France believes that full face veils are a barrier to living together. 93%. 79% believe that wearing even a headscarf is a barrier to living together. And only 26% of France, 26%, has a positive image of Islam. So we have a very serious context of discrimination. One study that I looked at was Muslim women who are trying to apply for employment. In order to get visa status, you have to prove employment in France, as most Western countries require. And so Muslim women feel a lot of pressure to secure this employment. The problem is that Muslim women have more visual representation of their faith. They wear the headscarf, they wear hijab or niqab. Muslim women who applied with a French CV-sounding name, a French name on their CV, or a French-sounding name on their CV, were received positively 60% of the time. If they used their Arabic name, they were rejected 60% of the time, just by their name. If the CV required a photo in addition to name and details, the rejection rate jumps even higher to 70%. So there's a lot more to go into. Bellwether and Notre Dame have authored a report that's forthcoming about our findings, about the implications of the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in France. But let me just conclude by saying that both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are on the rise. There's been a 200% increase in anti-Semitic attacks. There was a 29% increase in Islamophobic attacks. And as I mentioned, instead of thinking about one group being persecuted more than the other, just think about the channels. So the Jewish anti-Semitic attacks are happening through the private sphere, through homes and schools. They're most often to lead in injuries or death. Discrimination against Muslims is more widespread. It's a larger population of people. It's more political, and it's passing through the public sphere. All of the antagonism against Muslims is also integrated with, as I mentioned, the statistics of immigration and migration. France has accepted the Holocaust Memorial definition of anti-Semitism. There is no definition for Islamophobia. There is no definition for anti-Muslim hatred. And the Ministry of Interior for the French government tracks each year the number of anti-Semitic attacks. There is no record or current methodology for the data keeping of anti-Muslim attacks. So although we contacted multiple government bodies, I can't tell you the number of anti-Muslim attacks because they don't record it. It's not kept in the data. So hopefully this paints a broad picture of where we're at in terms of the French context, in terms of religion. I'll just end by saying one other insight. Women who wear hijab in the Muslim community, they participated in a survey during one of the investigations. There's been a separatism law that was passed in 2010 that allows the French government to, in the name of safety and anti-terrorism, shut down Muslim organizations, civil society, worship, protests. Most of the Palestinian protests following October 7th were canceled or banned for the first 2 weeks following the attack, and then it was appealed at the national court, but there's still huge swaths of power to shut down Muslim speech. For women who wear hijab, it's more than just political speech. All the women who were interviewed during the niqab ban, there was just about 300 or so women who were part of a strong niqab community. They all emphasize, look, we're wearing this because we believe in our God and we love our God. This isn't political for us. This is personal for us. It has implications for health and economy. If women in the Muslim community don't feel comfortable leaving their homes without their headscarves, the data shows that they don't. They don't leave their homes. They don't exercise. They don't participate in economy. And so in addition to thinking about the religious freedom implications, we need to be thinking about the public health implications and the economic implications. So hopefully this gives a broad overview of where we're headed and some of the statistics that will really inform the discussion about laïcité and some of the case studies that are shared by my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. We really appreciate that. And next, if we could show the video that was prepared by our colleague who hopefully is having a very wonderful flight at this moment and comfortably arriving in Chicago. Her husband is here, though, in her support. But anyways, we're really looking forward to her historical analysis and presentation of laïcité, because once again, you cannot understand what is happening in France without understanding this concept.
So laïcité is often translated as secularism. However, laïcité has a very specific meaning in the French Republican legal framework. It is the concept that defines first the separation between the church and the state, but also the fact that the state has no right of intervening in any religious matters. And also that any individual can practice or not practice any faith whatsoever without being bothered by anyone. So on the paper, laïcité seems wonderful. However, its origins are a bit darker. In 1789, the first principles of laïcité appear in the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Sooner than 3 years later, in 1792, many religious orders were persecuted and many monks and nuns were either forced into exile or decapitated. Later in the 19th century, laïcité comes back at the core of the political debates after the Affaire Dreyfus, when Capitaine Dreyfus, a Jewish military officer, was unjustly accused of collaborating with the enemy and of spying. It was soon proved that Dreyfus was innocent. However, this quarrel started more discussions about the place of the Jewish community in France. In 1905, however, the debates in the Republic about the different religions and their place within the church resulted in a more radical separation between church and state, when the laws of 1905 stated that Catholicism would no longer be the official religion of France, and also that the state would no longer provide any financial support for parishes. The result of that was that many religious teaching orders were, here again, forced into exile, and that many people felt threatened when the Republic intervened to make a specific account of the wealth of the church in what was known as the Querelle des Inventaires, the quarrel of the inventories, when Republican officers forced tabernacles open to see if there wouldn't be any hidden treasure in them. As a result, by the start of the 20th century, it does seem that there is a general agreement on the laïcité, but that is mainly because the Catholic use of the connections between politics and religions was set aside and no longer possible because of this separation. So the Catholics were, so to speak, the scapegoats of the French understanding of the Republican laïcité. Nowadays, we hear of laïcité much more when it comes to what women should or should not wear. In 2004, there was a law about the interdiction of wearing ostensibly religious signs in public schools and in places of civil service. As a result, a French girl could wear a headscarf out of school, but as soon as she entered school, she would need to remove it. More recently, we have heard about this question again on the question of the abaya. So, what separates a long dress from an Islamic long dress? So it seems that laïcité has a hard time defining what can seem as a signal for the use of clothing as a rallying sign for radical Islam, and moments when, well, it's just a piece of fabric. Symmetrically, especially after the attacks on the Hypercacher and in the Bataclan, members of the Jewish community felt so unsafe that they were wondering whether it was all right to wear a kippah in the street on the Shabbat. Some see wearing it as an act of resistance. Some others think that, given the circumstances, it's not the wisest choice. So this came back into the debates after the attacks of the 7th of October of the Hamas on Israeli civilians. Many people in France have expressed their fear of a surge of anti-Semitism, and only very recently, a 12-year-old girl was raped by 13-year-old boys in a banlieue just because she was Jewish. The question we might ask ourselves is, what can laïcité do at a time when terrorist attacks show the danger of the use of religion as a political weapon? It seems that laïcité cannot do much, and that, on the contrary, it only served to deprive people from a sense of religious and cultural belonging through the daily expression of their faith in harmless ways. As a result, Islamic attires are now used even in the post-colonial debate, and many women in the banlieue see the fact of having the right to wear a headscarf as almost an act of resistance against colonial France. The trouble is that this creates an intricate mixture of problems that are actually very separate: the geopolitical, the private faith, the question of faith in the public space. So it does not seem that laïcité offers such a safe space for everyone to express their religious beliefs in a harmless way. The problem with laïcité is that it does not set itself as separate from religions, it sets itself as above religions and sees the private faith as almost a quirk or a ludicrous pastime that some people would do and some others would not. There is little appreciation for what faith can mean at a deep and private level for people of different faiths in the framework of laïcité, because it was originated in an anti-religious and specifically anti-Catholic feeling. So what laïcité has achieved in France is that it has replaced Mary by Marianne. It has replaced faith, hope, and charity by liberté, égalité, fraternité, but it did not give anyone a sense of rootedness, a sense of belonging that many will look for in religious communities and in individual religious faith. So when we're talking about laïcité, we should remember that it is, after all, an outdated legal concept, and that we might need to reassess the place of religion and public worship in French citizenship today. Thank you very much.
And just in case in 10 minutes you don't quite understand laïcité, during our delegation, I'm pretty sure our students, and us inclusive, it's the how it works in international work. It probably took the entire weekend asking every single person we met with to really understand the French understanding of laïcité. And so hopefully we can drill down a little bit more, particularly with our French panelists. But next I would like to go to Luc, who will give a little bit more legal and international law perspective.
Thank you so much, Kimberlie, and good morning to everyone. Before I dive into my presentation on France, I just want to give a brief overview of the organization I work for. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is a U.S. government agency. We're independent and bipartisan, and we monitor religious freedom conditions abroad, and we look towards international human rights law when we do so. So we look towards Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights when we do our analysis. At the Commission, I cover Europe, religious freedom conditions in Europe, with a particular eye toward anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. Today, my presentation will be in three quick parts, I promise. The first will focus on the French government's anti-cult efforts and how those negatively impact religious organizations and associations. The second part of my presentation will focus on the prohibition on face coverings in public, which of course particularly impacts Muslim women, as we've heard, and why that prohibition is inconsistent with international human rights law. And the final part of my presentation will focus on the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in France. So to begin, the French government's targeting of religious organizations through its anti-cult efforts, I'll highlight two ways that they try to undertake those efforts. The first is the French government does release disparaging statements about religious organizations and associations that it alleges to be cults or to engage in cultic deviances. There's a French government ministry with the acronym MIVALUDES that releases an annual report that identifies religious associations and organizations that it believes to be cultic or to engage in cult-like deviances. In addition to that, the French government does support nonprofit organizations that do similar such work. And just to give everyone an example of the sort of religious group that the French government identifies as being cult-like, in a number of their annual reports, they've referred to Jehovah's Witnesses as engaging in cultic deviances. So in addition to that disparaging language, what we see at the Commission is the French government also has a law that allows for the investigation and prosecution of cults and members of cults under certain circumstances. And these two factors are particularly concerning to us at the Commission for two reasons. The first is, of course, Article 18 protects the rights of individuals to manifest their religion or belief individually or collectively. And that right is not dependent on whether the French government or any other government makes an allegation that your religious organization is a cult. That's number one. Number two, of course, Article 18 also protects the rights of individuals to freely adopt any religion or belief of their choice, and without any pressure or coercion. Now, if we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who's considering joining the Jehovah's Witnesses in France, it would be reasonable to think that you may be disinclined to join the Jehovah's Witnesses, given that the French government releases disparaging statements about the Jehovah's Witnesses and its reports, and also that there's a law that allows for, under certain circumstances, the investigation and prosecution of the Jehovah's religious associations, including the Jehovah's Witnesses. Before I talk about prohibitions on face coverings, I'd just like to say, France is not the only country we see with these anti-cult kind of efforts. There are similar efforts in countries that we consider to be far more repressive. A good example of that is Russia, where the government uses its anti-cult legislation to shutter disfavored religious groups. And I think it's instructive to reflect on the similarities between the anti-cult efforts in France and those in another country that we consider to be far more repressive. Moving on to the prohibition on face coverings in public. So the French government does have a law that prohibits wearing face coverings in public, and as we've heard, it does particularly impact Muslim women who may wish to wear face coverings in public. Violations of that law are punishable with an €150 fine, I believe. And as we've heard, part of the motivation for this law is this concept of laïcité and the French government's desire to impose its conception of secularism on society. The prohibition is inconsistent with international human rights law, and in fact, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which is responsible for adjudicating disputes about Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, said so. And the reason that they said so is that France's purported reasons for adopting the law, which were number one, to protect public safety, and number two, to promote public trust, did not have a connection to an all-out ban on the face coverings in public. So they found that there was a disconnect between their purported objectives and what the law actually did in substance. Before I quickly move on to the rise in anti-Semitism, I would like to say that we were also monitoring the French election cycle recently, and just two anti-Muslim tropes that I would like to highlight that we saw and were concerned about. The first is we saw some figures seek to cast Muslims in France as those outside of French society or somehow less than French. That's one. And the second one is we saw rhetoric that drew on these fears that Muslims in France were trying to Islamicize society, and that's number two. Finally, I want to address the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in France. We've seen this, of course, I'm sure as everyone else has, over the past 9 to 10 months. And we've seen it really in two ways. The first way is we've seen a tremendous rise in anti-Semitic speech. So we've seen, the proliferation of ancient anti-Semitic tropes like conspiracy theories centering on Jewish people, or these like false allegations that Jewish people are puppeteers controlling world events and world leaders. And we've seen it be particularly pervasive in the online space. So that's one way we've seen anti-Semitism rise in France. And another way is, of course, as we've heard, anti-Semitic acts. So we have seen the harassment of Jewish university students. We've seen the vandalism of Jewish cemeteries and synagogues, and even the French Holocaust Museum. And we have also seen, of course, attacks, physical attacks. One of the panelists referenced the rape of a 12-year-old Muslim girl, in addition to a 12-year-old Jewish girl. And in addition to that, we've seen beatings and stabbings. And before I conclude and pass the floor back over to Kimberlie, I'd just like to say we were also monitoring the general election cycle for anti-Semitic tropes, and just two among the many that I want to highlight. The first is, anti-Semitic issues rising during the campaign is, number one, we saw some figures seek to downplay or deny the existence of anti-Semitism in France. And number two, we did see some figures try to use the fight against anti-Semitism as a wedge issue to attract voters. And I think at the Commission, what we would say is the fight against anti-Semitism shouldn't be politicized. And we believe that all those in France should take an honest look at the state and the rise of anti-Semitism in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to move swiftly to Justice Ann Powers, who has truly, I think, kind of an unparalleled perspective, given the fact that she was able to work on these specific issues at the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you,
and thank you for the invitation to join this panel. I'm very much a last-minute addition to the panel, but very happy to be here. I should say I lived in France for almost 8 years. It's the most beautiful country, it has the most wonderful language, and it has so much to give to the world, and particularly to Europe, in terms of leadership. And I suppose I see this one area in terms of how it deals with the question of the manifestation of faith in public as an area where perhaps progress might still be made. I should say, although laïcité, and has been beautifully explained, and its history and context have been explained to us, was the principal defence put forward by France in many of the headscarf cases, the court's acceptance of it as a principle, in fact, predated French cases. It was in Leyla Sahin, a young medical student in Turkey, in Istanbul. She was prevented from continuing her medical studies because she wanted to wear a headscarf in the university. And again, going back to this separation between church and state, she was refused permission to complete her final exams, and ultimately she had to work elsewhere. And there was just the court found no violation of Article 9 in that case. It was a Grand Chamber case, and again relied upon, the state's interest in separating church and state. There was one dissenting opinion by Judge Tulkens where she really questioned what signal the court was sending to Muslim women in Turkey. There was no evidence that any unrest had been caused. But if you read Leyla Sahin, it's almost as if the young Muslim woman was the cause of the problem, that somehow she was creating unrest by manifesting her faith in public through the simple wearing of a headscarf. And then, of course, after Leila Sahin came Dahlab and Switzerland, and that too endorsed the principle of laïcité. Again, no suggestion whatsoever that any unrest had been caused to the children in the classroom, no complaints from parents about the fact that the teacher had converted to Islam and was wearing a headscarf. Everything was going fine until the state decided, no, this is not, in fact, respecting the principle of laïcité, and the young woman, she had to lose her job or take off her headscarf, basically. And in Dahlab, you will see now, it's an older case, but the language of the court is it's passing a value judgment, I think, if you read it, on Islam, even though, of course, jurists and courts and states are not entitled to assess the value of a religious belief. They're not entitled to get inside, whether it's the church's teachings or the teachings on Islam or on Judaism, and say which of those bits are good and which of those. That's not the court's function. It's not the state's function. But nevertheless, you'll find in Leila Sahin agreement with the Federal Court of Switzerland, where it noted that the Islamic practice of wearing a headscarf was hard to square with the principle of gender equality. So implicit in that, you can see that there's kind of a suspicion around, Muslims don't really treat their women equally. There's a gender equality issue here. And the court described it as difficult to reconcile. So the wearing of a headscarf was difficult to reconcile, appeared difficult to reconcile, with the message of tolerance, equality, and respect for all. So, that language is already sending a signal, and I'm happy to say, of course, in later case law, particularly in Avida and the United Kingdom, the court seemed to have realised the mistake it had made and pulled back from that. But after Dahlab, there followed a series of 6 cases involving French school children, Jewish boys wanting to wear the kippah, Hindu children who wanted to wear the scarf. I'm afraid I can't remember the precise term that is used for that, and also Muslim children who were who wanted to wear the Islamic headscarf. And again, if you read those cases, which didn't even get to the stage of being admissible because the precedent case law was there, you will see an endorsement of laïcité, and I have to say, I do think that laïcité, if it's loosely translated as neutrality, is not about the prohibition of any religious symbol in the public space, but rather the state should not endorse or be seen to endorse or fund any one particular state, any one particular religion. But normally when the court is looking at a violation of human rights and the state's interference with a human right, what it will do, it will look, well, what is the objective that is achieved, that is sought to be achieved here? And is there a legal basis to that? And of course there was the legal French law in 2004, so there was a legal basis. The objective, of course, was to respect laïcité and state neutrality. But then it goes to a third question, and it asks, well, is this proportionate? Is the level of interference with the right, is it necessary in a democratic society? Is it like the least intrusive way of achieving the aims that the state seems to achieve? And notwithstanding the fact that the children in school were to be deprived of their education, they were essentially told, well, go home and be educated at home, depriving them of the opportunity which education brings, socialization, development. That didn't seem to weigh in the proportionality assessment as being rather significant. Now, I think to deprive a child of the experience of being educated with other children in a society, that's a fairly weighty factor in my view if you're looking at a proportionality assessment. But it didn't feature. Then move on a few years, so that's education. So the manifestation of religious faith for Muslim women, for any children in school, prohibited in the context of the sphere of education. Move along to 2016 and we have the case of Ibrahim and France. And in Ibrahim, a doctor's contract was not renewed because she refused to remove her headscarf in a hospital. And I always find it really kind of moving at one level because I had published a paper in the Oxford Journal of Law and Review on that case. And the very night I'd sent it in, I had an appointment with my father the next day in hospital, and this wonderful ophthalmologist was there in her headscarf testing him, and her whole commitment was to him. The fact she was wearing a headscarf was neither here nor there. She was a woman of faith, obviously, but she was utterly dedicated. And I remember thinking, what damage is being done by this doctor, treating my father in the best possible way, and yet at the same time, she couldn't do that if she were in France. And the court again found no violation and accepted that it was okay for the state to do what it did. But I just want to read a comment that Professor Eva Brems made when she was reflecting on Article 9 and the case of Ibrahimian. And she says, "The number of jobs in the French public service is around 5.6 million, while the number of people in France who have a job is about 26 million. Hence, the French exclude Muslim women who wear a headscarf, as well as Sikh men who wear a turban and Jewish men who wear a kippah, from more than 21% of all potential jobs to which they might aspire in France. It seems that the court might usefully have taken aboard this factor in its proportionality assessment. So 21% of jobs don't even apply. They're closed to you. The broad interpretation by the French courts of a general neutrality principle in the applicant's case affected not only the renewal of her contract with that specific hospital, but her chances of employment in the entire public sector." And Eva Brems goes on to say that the growing generation of Muslim women are obviously educated. There may have been a time when there was a perception that Muslim women were somehow repressed and they were controlled by men. But the fact that they're taking up their rightful place in hospitals and in schools, she's saying the growing generation of Muslim women are educated and ready to participate in and contribute to society. And ironically, while those choosing to wear a headscarf were initially labelled as voiceless and oppressed, they are today, according to Dr. Chaib, another scholar, a co-scholar with Brems, and notwithstanding their education and professional capabilities, not only facing glass ceilings as women, but they are facing concrete ceilings as Muslim women. So I think paradoxically, the more visible they become in society and the more they try to participate through work and education, the more limiting measures are imposed upon them. One last point I wanted to make was in relation to SAS, this case about the prohibition on wearing the full face veil. The justification the court used in that case was this principle of le vivre ensemble. We live together. I want to see you. I want to look you in the eye. And a question was posed again by these Belgian scholars to the effect, I wonder would the court allow the same doctrine of le vivre ensemble, we have to live together as society, would they allow Russia to use that in terms of its propagation or its prohibition on what it perceives as propagation of culture of the LGBTQ community. So if Russia said, well, I'm sorry, we don't want visibility of that community in our country because of the principle of le vivre ensemble, we all want to live together and get on, would the court allow that same principle to be used in those circumstances? My worry, I suppose, today, when France can do so much for the rest of Europe and can offer such leadership, is that it would just be alert to the fact that, in the lead up to the Second World War, it was very evident that scapegoating was there. When you see one community being scapegoated, the Jewish community being the cause of all the problems, whenever you see scapegoating, for me, it's an alert, it's a signal, it's saying, let's pay attention to what we're doing here. And I think the same kind of alertness and awareness as to what's happening with the Muslim women and the Muslim community in France is something that we really need to pay attention to. There's a great fear, I suppose, in all of us of otherness. If you don't think like me, if you don't look like me, if you don't talk like me, if you don't believe what I believe, I'm afraid of you deep down. And I think it's wonderful to have occasions like this where we can sit together, we can talk about our differences, we can pursue truth in freedom. That's really what it's all about. And I would love to see the day when France takes the lead in Europe in saying, let us sit down, let us not be afraid of difference, let us respect otherness, and let us pursue, let us engage in the pursuit of truth so that we can achieve égalité, liberté, and fraternité. Thank you so much.
Justice Powers, and I just want you to know she was invited yesterday, and so it was that was an incredible presentation, and I think we all benefited for your graciousness in our late invitation to you. Next, I'd like to pass it over to Haifa. I think her experience is so unparalleled because we look at so many things, especially as lawyers, as law, and we look at it at the micro or macro level. But Haifa has been on the ground fighting this fight in the grassroots space, which is a very, very hard and daunting thing to do. And so and she was one of our favorite meetings that we had throughout our delegation. And so it was our honor for her to be able to join us today. Thank you, Haifa.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I traveled yesterday, not today, but it was a hard moment. I'm sorry for my décalage for this morning. Thank you very much also for all the presentation. It's really important to understand the goal of my presentation. Of course, I'm speaking about sports. Maybe it's not essential, and especially Muslim hijabis in sports. Do you see hijabis around you practicing sport? Is it a real essential question? That's the point. You mentioned so many important key elements around the understanding of secularism or laïcité, and also the best traduction of secularism concretely. It's the vivre ensemble, it's the l'altérité, to be able to understand, to speak, to communicate. And if you don't have that, you cannot succeed in this objective. Yes, I'm really, running around different campaigns. I'm defined myself as a sociologist, but slowly, I'm an activist. I'm not, totally satisfied by this work because it's more complex, and I'm not. It's not the goal of my presentation, but I worked with the hijabers, first of all, around the campaign Let Us Play, and now we are really deep in the campaign of maybe this. Is it good? Oh, I see. Yeah. Do you see? And after that, with Basketball pour toutes. The action research mobilization, it's something interesting because I give the voice, or I give them the opportunity to take the mic about their history. And sometimes it's complex because, there is so many shame. Maybe sometimes the consequences of the colonialism and also all the influences, injunctions, you are not proud of yourself. And there is so many difficulties to understand what's happened inside myself. How can you deal with your right, impose your right, understand the consequences of the misunderstanding of a bad secularism if you are not able to define yourself? That's the point. I'm just helping with my research, with the interviews, different population, to put a light and impulse awareness and understanding. If I can present the second one document, you have normally the picture of of the different action. 70% of the acts of violence recorded by the CCIF, it's the collective who fight against Islamophobia in France. At that time, they were active. Now they're totally disparu. But 70% of the act was against women who wear the hijab. And that's dramatic. And since the 19th, the first case of the hijab in the society visible, since 19, the veil has been demonized, pushing it back into the private sphere, and of course laws follows and stigmatize and criminalize Muslims, hijabis. But the media and the politics also have a big responsibility. We easily spoke about media, but now, and especially with this last election, we hear the internal voice of hatred and negative word. This was for the first time very visible, and now we know that maybe my neighborhood, that I'm always smiling with her, sharing, coffee or tea, maybe she votes against hijabis or Muslim community. That's, amplify the stigmatization, the fear, and the shame. How can you provoke a change in this situation? If it's not you, who can do that? If you don't have this power, it's not only a power, it's a big power to fight this war. I want to present you different kind of citation of different words. The first one is Roxana Maraxineanu. This is the Minister of Sport. She said, "I'm in favor of democratizing sport, whether you have your head covered or not. My aim as Minister for Sport is to reach out people and bring them in as they are, with or without a veil, little by little, allowing them to experience a social mix." This is beautiful. This is exactly what we need. Why it was not impulsed more than just a little word? There is no pedagogical work around the discourse, and that was not enough. And especially when you read all this different others' positive analysis, you have this the bill in 2021, the bill who combines separatism. They want to put a bill specially against the hijab, but the two comments of the rapporteur of the special committee say that it's not authorized to exclude or to accept the hijab ban. That's beautiful. That's exactly what we need. And after that, you have different kind of article in sports, especially in football. You have the Article 1 in football, the most important, and it's clearly stigmatized that any religious denominational sign have to be visible, and soccer field, stadium, gymnasium has to be neutral. And after that, in 2022, the French Federation of Basketball decided to put a new article, the Article 9.3, and say that's strictly forbidden to wear any equipment with a religious or political connotation. Now you have the problem of this situation. The hijabeuses asked to the Conseil d'État to decide about the Article 1, if they have to accept this Article 1, or they just have to change the Article 1 because it's non-constitutional. And they decided the ban appears necessary for the smooth running of matches, particularly in that it prevents any confrontation unrelated to sport. The ban is therefore necessary, appropriate, and proportionate, and does not constitute discrimination. That's the point. If you are not able to evaluate the proportionality of a law, why you impose that? If there is no kindness, if there is no discussion, if there is no data, why you impose the situation? You are responsible of the consequences, and the consequences is a misunderstanding, a segregation, maybe an apartheid, and that's a sad situation. Now I don't have a lot of time to explain you concretely my work, and it was not the objective of the presentation. But now, in this context of paradoxes, of incoherence, the response of the Council of State, concretely, what is possible to do? what is the next step? We create a open letter, different petition in change.org. We create different groups, les hijabeuses, Basketball pour toutes. We really want to engage discussion, but you know, the wave, it's too big, and we cannot change a mentality alone. And I think that's the beauty of the meetings, and I am thank you very much that we have this opportunity to meet us in Paris. But maybe you, with your responsibility, with your opportunity, with your possibility, maybe we can, you know, connect things, create things. It's just a question of open-minded, of discussion, and opportunities. Right? I'm just, you know, very curious and open to any discussion around that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I want to highlight, as we are likely all going to be enjoying the Olympics, for you to pay attention to the fact that in France, the other athletes from other countries are able and will likely be wearing their hijabs, and yet those who represent France will not be representing France. And I think in the work that we do, I've heard it said, you know, all the simple problems have been fixed, right? And so a lot of what we are dealing with and confronting and grappling are these wicked problems that are so complex. When we think about the issues of what was discussed by our panelists, we talked about gender equality and terrorism, cult, migration and xenophobia. We talked about politics and employment issues. And so this is not a simple issue. And so it's important that we understand and try to find the ways and spaces in which we can make an impact and make a difference. And so again, I just want to really highlight the work that everybody's doing from their place, but also specifically that Haifa has worked tirelessly on, because it is a space, as we talk to government leaders, that there may be a place for it. If maybe not in general society, people may not be comfortable wearing their hijab, but if they see on a French national team a woman with a hijab, that could have a large impact on French society and the world, and I think it's astounding. There's so much to say, and we have such expertise here, but our time is actually winding down, and so I would just like to take a few questions and make sure that we end on time for what will be a lovely luncheon and performance by the that we will have at lunch. So if we can open it up to maybe a couple questions, we'll gather them all at once and then open it up.
Thank you very much. Terrific discussion. Two questions. Legally speaking, what can be done to amend the 1906 outdated legal concept? And also on the women in sports, we talked about this when we were visiting Paris, but if you have done any corporate engagement to see businesses with a big brand helping to promote French athletes, female athletes with a religious outfit.
If there are any other questions, let's take them now, and then we'll kind of go ahead.
I was recently in Montreal and came to be shocked that here in North America they had adopted in their province this same ban on headscarves and hijabs, and it was very disturbing to the interfaith groups that we work with. And it was amazing to us that it could have jumped from France across the Atlantic here and taken root in North America. And they just are more French, I suppose, than they are Canadian. And they've just adopted to, I don't know if there's any work that any of you are doing in Canada on this matter, but it is spreading.
Thank you. And then was there one, or I think maybe two more? We'll gather your questions and then we'll try to answer and close. Go ahead, please.
May. I agree with the analysis about the case law of European Court of Human Rights, but I think that the problem is not French-based. I mean, it's rather broader in many European countries, and this is the reason, the explanation of this contradictory case law of European Court of Human Rights. I think that there is a problematic approach, not only from the European Court, both in Luxembourg and Strasbourg, because there are two European courts competent for headscarf issues in Europe, but also in the different European states. Then the problem is how to let's say, to accommodate Islamic practices in their own daily life and in their legislation. This is very clear also in Sharia law cases before the European Court of Human Rights that were also contradictory between the first Grand Chamber in 2000 and the last in 2017. Then I think that the problem is not only French, it's European, and I repeat, in my view, and I want also your reaction, your response is based to the relation with Islamic faith, not Jewish faith, but Islamic faith. Thanks.
Thank you. I know there are other questions, but we are very short on time. So please come up and speak to our panelists afterwards. I'm going to allow our panelists an opportunity to respond to the questions and just give kind of final thoughts at this moment. So if we can start down there.
Maybe
with
I'll just
Justice
take
Powers.
the first one in terms of how to bring about legislative change. In my experience, change in the law comes in either one of, or change in society comes in either one of two ways. The law changes and people get used to it. And we saw that certainly in Ireland, and then it swept throughout Europe when the ban on smoking in restaurants came in. Everybody was saying, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this in Ireland? You can't smoke in a pub, you can't smoke in a restaurant. Then Italy, you can't have a cigarette with your coffee, whatever. The law changed, people got used to it, and it was great. And everybody now agrees, I think, that it's so much nicer to be able to have a meal. So that's one way, which is just to change the law and society will follow. The other way, of course, is to change society, to educate at local level, and then hopefully when that educational process takes place at local level, the locals elect representatives who then in turn bring about legislative change. Which of the two is better? I don't know. I think in this case it's thorny, so I can't see the law just being changed and for the reasons that you also mentioned, the last speaker. It's a much wider pan-European problem, but I think the only way in this instance is through education, through discussion, through challenging the proportionality of measures that certainly when one looks at it, seem to be disproportionate in terms of the benefit that's sought to be gained. So that's my little contribution.
And Rachel?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. In the week that the full niqab, which is the full covering, in the week that legislation was passed in France, the week Germany and Belgium adopted the same legislation. So they had the legislation ready and were waiting for France. So when we talk about the precipice of leadership in this moment, the significance of France as a bellwether in this moment, I just don't think that can be understated. And to highlight what Justice Power was saying earlier, Bellwether is looking at the trends, the global trends towards genocide. France is not near genocidal events, but there is scapegoating, there is hate speech, we're seeing a huge marginalization, and the Holocaust just wasn't that long ago. It started in France and Germany. So I think we need to be, I don't want to create a false sense of urgency given that we're living in a polycrisis, but certainly on the European stage, I don't think there's a more important leadership voice or example than France on this issue for religious freedom writ large and for broader global trends to just combat the scapegoating and hate speech and disinformation.
Thank you, Rachel. Luke?
Sure. I'll address how USURF is trying to make change, although I don't think there's a silver bullet, as been said previously. So we do engage with our U.S. government partners, and we encourage them to raise these religious freedom concerns in meetings they have with both their European Union colleagues and their colleagues in France. And we do the same when we engage with our colleagues in France and at the European Union level, is we do raise these religious freedom concerns and make it understood that it is a concern of the United States government. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
For the question of cooperation, and we started with Nike. It was beautiful at the beginning, but for work with a business like Nike, you have to be as big as Nike. And of course, when you are very fragile and you are learning alone and also with the new collective, it's too much. But I hope that it will be, we learn from this experience and we can be able to speak and work concretely, equally also, not, it's not an institution or a firm who impose the strategy. It's really from the ground. I think that's another problematic. And for the imperialism of Canada, I use the word of imperialism of France, French, Francophone, Francophonie, and also the mentality of French. It's kind of romantisme à la française. We think that, that's the laïcité, that's the French, we have to be like this. We don't want to be like the Anglophone and the Americans. I guess that's the mentality, the Québécois. But this imperialism, it's built in a false definition of secularism. When you are in something so non-representative of what is secularism, imagine slowly by slowly what it's possible to transform. And there is so many other things, and it's not the goal, but the immigration, the first immigration in France, it's not the same as the Maghrebians, Muslims majority, not the same as the migrants, Maghrebians who go to Canada. It's very different. The power is different, and maybe we can also understand some difficulties. The leadership. I think the key, the solution of all these things is the leadership of the community, of the Muslims community, of the women. If you don't have leaders, Muslims in France, recognized by women, there is no possibility to solution. If we want to engage women, hijabis or non-hijabis in this discussion, we need leaders, women, Muslims. That's all.
Well, I just want to thank, we are out of time. I want to thank my wonderful panelists that were able to give us a really wide view of the issues that are occurring in France. So first, I just want to say thank you so much.